People often ask me who chose the books of the Bible. Of course, often a question can contain a statement, and I think that question does contain a statement. It contains a statement that someone chose the books of the Bible. And I think the right answer to that is either no one or maybe God. But what we can't say is that there was some group or committee which chose the books we have in the Bible. Take the four Gospels for an example. The earliest manuscript we have of the four Gospels and also of the book of Acts together is in Dublin. It comes from around the year 225 AD. That is 100 years before Constantine presided over the first great council of the church in the year 325. So in other words, we can say that there was no church council that chose those four Gospels. In fact, when we look at where those four Gospels were used, we find that that manuscript now in Dublin came from southern Egypt, showing that people in southern Egypt at that time were using the four Gospels. But if you went over to France, to a place called Lyon, you could find from around the year 185 someone called Irenaeus, who was the bishop there, saying that having the four Gospels is just as basic as having four cardinal directions. So he was in the second century, late second century, and said that having four Gospels was a really natural thing. And then from around the year 175, if you go over to Syria, you'd find that there was a man there who rolled the four Gospels we now have into one continuous chronological narrative so that it could be used for study. So we find that whether it was in Syria or France or southern Egypt, all places that are quite far apart, they were all using the four Gospels, and they were doing that at a time when there was no central city of Christian power, there was no great power base, and there was no system within Christianity that could have imposed the four Gospels upon all of those different places. In other words, those four Gospels got to be recognised as the right Gospels by their own credentials. People often say, weren't some Gospels excluded from the Bible? I don't think there were. I don't think there's no record that other Gospels were ever even discussed for inclusion. And in fact, there isn't a record of early discussion amongst Christians about which books of the Bible you should have. Rather, things like the four Gospels have such credentials that they force their own recognition on people in all sorts of different circumstances. People, when they say who chose the Gospels, might be asking a question a bit like, who chose the winner of the marathon? Well, really, it's not the judges that choose the winner of the marathon unless there's a photo finish. Normally, what happens is the person who's just out of the front of the pack wins. The judges are just there to ensure fair play. And really, I'd want to say that the four Gospels are so far ahead of the pack, so far ahead of any other Gospels in terms of their credibility, that they simply won the day. People could see that they were authentic. When we contrast them with other so-called Gospels, apocryphal Gospels, things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and so on, we find that the four Gospels are used much more widely, and they have far greater knowledge of the Israel of Jesus' day. They know the land, they know the layout of the land, they know the customs, and they speak in very Jewish ways. The apocryphal Gospels, by contrast, don't, because when Christianity began, it began in the cradle of Judaism. All the earliest Christians were Jews. And that means if we're expecting early Gospels should sound Jewish, and the four Gospels do. But what we find is when we go to apocryphal Gospels, they sound very un-Jewish, because they're written later on when so many people have forgotten about how Christianity began. And that's why they're so removed from the time and place of Jesus.